Welcome, friends, to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And we are off to New York City this week. Right now, we're having fun. Maybe we're in Central Park or something at the Strand. I want to go to the Strand bookstore while I'm there. There's so many things we want to do. Go do the touristy stuff, but do other kind of stuff. Maybe go to some museums or something. Hopefully we're having a great time while this episode's coming out. We appreciate your patience with us as we release back-to-back From the Vault episodes. This week, we are going with The Haunting, the 1963 adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And if you've been following our social media and stuff, you may have seen that at some point, I went on the Why the Book Wins podcast and talked about this film with Laura from over there, who's a friend of the show. And this is when we covered it. So this came before that. And I remember we had a good time with this version, and it's a lot more faithful version of Shirley Jackson's novel.
Super notable director, Robert Wise, director of West Side Story, The Sound of Music, The Andromeda Strain.
Yeah. I think you kind of blew my mind when you brought that up in the episode. I did not know that.
If you want to know another one that he directed in 1963, check this out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just put out one more time. We need comments on our Patreon poll. We need comments on our post that's on our Patreon. It is for our quarterly projects. Do suggestions on there, and then not only write any suggestions you have on there, but vote for suggestions that you agree with. Those are due by the 18th of March. And then we will put a poll up that will run from the 19th to the 23rd for our patrons to decide. It'll be the top 4 vote getters. We'll then go to a final poll that will then determine our first quarterly project, which we will do when we get back from New York City. So please take a chance, take a moment to go and help affect what we cover on this podcast. This is now the time to do it.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what the community comes up with.
Me too. All right, enjoy this previous Patreon exclusive.
This week, we are revisiting Hill House. We're going back to Shirley Jackson's story, this time adapted by Robert Wise. Does that name ring any bells for you?
For me, no, I don't think so.
Well-known director, but some of his famous credits are he directed West Side Story and also The Sound of Music.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, massive. Wow. And then he won the Academy Award for Best Film Editing for Citizen Kane.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this guy's worked on some pretty big deal movies.
Big time. Yeah, I was reading that at one point, Robert Wise, I think it was in the 70s, he was the president of the Directors Guild of America. Massive and an important responsibility too. And a lot of people look to somebody like that. And then eventually he became the president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences from 1985 to 88.
Wow. Okay. Very cool.
Very involved in the film community.
Yeah, I am a little embarrassed that I didn't know. I mean, the name sounds somewhat familiar, but other than that, I had no
Honestly,
idea.
Yeah, no, it was kind of the same for me as well. I'd heard the name, and then when I realized when he was the editor of Citizen Kane that's where I had heard before.
Okay. I do want to say Happy Halloween to any of our listeners who get this. I'm not sure when it's going to come out, actually, but it will be maybe on Halloween Day. And if so, Happy Halloween. And if you listen to it later, I hope you had a good one. This is kind of fun because it's our first really foray into horror for the month. And usually we do something far more horrific in October. But it's cool to revisit this book because it was an absolute favorite for me, at least from this year. Loved it. And that was this year, right? Have I got my years right?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so much fun, and this movie is far more faithful than the Mike Flanagan adaptation. So, while we're not going to worry about spoilers for this old movie, if you are interested in reading Shirley Jackson's novel, this discussion will spoil the novel because the plot is almost identical, with a few exceptions. So, just be aware of that. What were your general thoughts on watching this 1963 black and white adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House?
I feel like I had heard of The Haunting, because that's what this film is called, The Haunting.
Oh, we should say there is a 1999 adaptation with the same name, starring Liam Neeson and Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Which I have not
saw
seen.
that. I think I saw that when it came out in the theaters. That movie's not very good. I remember having issues with it even in 1999 when I was far less critical of movies.
Yeah.
At some point, I would like to watch that again now that I've seen this movie, because I think that would be a really interesting comparison. But yeah, this movie, way better. I'll just go ahead and say that way better than that movie for what it's worth, in my opinion.
So, it's a difficult task to try to pull off a story like Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House, but I think David Wise did a good job because although you can't get the specifics, the spiral that we get of our main character, Eleanor, you can kind of get some of it in the story. And honestly, the biggest representation on film for me was seeing the Hill House visually, the way that they decided to shoot it, and honestly, kind of cutting edge for the time period. They were using like certain lenses that they're like lending to like distortion in the image a little bit, and some of those like intense sequences, the way that they were cut together, I was just like, it felt very modern. And 63, like, I think there was the option to shoot in color at that point, but the decision was made to shoot in black and white because I think it does add something to the story. It's, that creepiness, the contrast on the walls at night, and with like the lights coming through the different rooms and things like that. And they shot it in a way that like added to claustrophobic. For the most part, you can see the ceiling in a lot of shots, which the kind of lends to like in the frame. If you could see the ceiling, it's kind of closing that frame in.
We talked about this in something, I can't remember what, but yeah, like when you can see the ceiling, that's kind of noteworthy because usually on sets not usually, but often on sets they won't have a ceiling. Because it won't be in the shot anyway, so they often won't worry about it.
If you're in a soundstage, they'll have lights hung up there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's where you put a lot of your lighting. So it's noteworthy, right? It's like it makes it feel more real in a way that I appreciate. And the other thing I noticed, I just want to get it out up front. There's mirrors in almost every scene.
Yes,
and
so well.
Even at times there's a mirror within a mirror, which I thought was really cool, and you could see the like touches of the actors moving, and it lent a sense of like in Flanagan's adaptation, there's like figures and things in the background, and I was kind of looking for that, but I was like, I don't know if they're going to be doing that in the 60s version, probably not. But what it did do was add that little bit of like, oh, there's a little bit of movement somewhere in the room I wasn't expecting, and it would be a reflection. And then also you have the whole thing with mirrors being like a window into another realm, and like all this stuff that works really well with mirrors. So I thought that part was really cool.
I definitely picked up on that too. The mirrors and the ways that they were using it. And honestly, this film came out in the 60s. The tension is still there in a horror film that I think a lot of horror films you'll go back and they won't hold up in ways. And this one, getting to the climax of the story, legit tense. Like I was like, wow, this really holds up. And that brings me to something that I wanted to talk about with the legacy of this film, is that directors like Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg have said that it's like a formative film for them. Martin Scorsese even goes as far as to place The Haunting first on his list of the 11th scariest horror films of all time.
That's awesome. And honestly, I think well-deserved, because I'm not someone... We talked about this a little bit in our Thing from Another World, maybe, episode, or Last Man on Earth. Both of those have been kind of throwback black and white films that we've covered as bonus episodes. I'm not someone who has watched a lot of older films like this from sort of the black and white era. And often when I do, I struggle to connect with them in the same way that I do just films that are in color and more modern. But I didn't have that problem with this movie, honestly, other than a few almost more cultural things that seemed very old-fashioned to me.
There's also like the acting of the time is very dramatic and comes from stage, so there's that.
Well, especially Julie Harris as Nell, which we'll talk about. But the point being that this movie, I had a good time watching it, and it felt like a really cool movie to be watching this time of year. And I was pleased to see a, mostly faithful adaptation of Jackson's novel. In some ways, I don't think it was as successful at certain things, but other things were really cool, and I loved seeing it on screen. And the little bit of, I didn't do research, but I just read a little bit about the movie at one point, and I saw that like its appreciation has grown over time. Like, I think people have looked at it and been like, this movie is actually really good. And it was, I think, an important film. And even now is listed among a lot of top, like, horror films of all times. We'll list this movie among them.
I also saw it on the list of, like, 1001 films to see before you die kind of list and that kind of thing. Like, it's all over the place. And the legacy of that, especially, like, in horror, like, I feel like if we go to watch 90s horror right now, there's going to be movies that really don't hold up and are just laughable.
Oh, for sure. Well, for one, like the special effects, because there's very little because of the time, right? It makes it kind of timeless. Whereas, a lot of stuff from the 90s, especially, there was this like dawn of CGI, right? Where it was like, we can now make a real wispy ghost come through a wall, so let's do it. And you look at it now and it looks terrible. Like, a lot of that stuff is, and I'm sure the 1999 film is filmed with some stuff like that. Whereas this is a lot more subtle, and that subtlety is reminiscent of the book, right? Like, there's not a lot of big scares in the book. It's a lot more internal and about the way the perception of Hill House twists the mind of Eleanor. And what I appreciated about this movie is that the screenwriter and the director seemed to understand that. Like, they really wanted to capture what the essential terror of Haunting of Hill House is. And it was a very close look at Eleanor. So, right. I appreciated that part of it for sure.
The big scares come from the characters, right? Like,
exactly.
It's like the characters being in peril, the characters being scared. And I think that pays off big time in this movie. Like you said, there's no spooky ghost coming through that's like the tension. And like, even we love Flanagan's adaptation, but Flanagan's adaptation, it's doing both, but it leans heavily on a lot of like scary, like, just to think of one, the fact that the door stuff of course comes from the book, but to see it adapted so well and to see the bending door and the way that the handles turning and stuff, like, that stuff really works. And it's like, that
they
unknown.
leaned into like, there's kind of a face in this wallpaper, and there's like, this mirror is dirty, and so when you look through it, it makes the room feel dirty, and like, there's all these little things that they're leaning on to make it subtle in a way that really is reminiscent of the book, and in a way that Flanagan's adaptation, as much as we liked, is not like that really. It's just a lot more modern.
It's definitely like modernized, and then it's of course really, really big on characters in that as well. I don't want to take that away from Flanagan's adaptation. Yeah. It's just the fact that they had the access to the technology and they could make these scary things. They wanted to lean on that as well, like jump scares and things popping out and creepy stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas this is more like, of that unknown quantity time period where it's like Alien and things like that, where they don't show it very often, or they don't show it at all in some horror films, and the way that ramps up the tension and sometimes that can be a letdown because people have expectations going into a movie. But if you find the right balance and it's rewarding like this is, I think even in the end you're like, wow, like Hill House is scary because it, if you go there, you'll spiral, and then you'll start to feel like the thing that you want is to be there at the house, and then you see what happens to Eleanor.
Yeah, which is like, I don't know, I love that so much in the book, so it's very cool to see that on screen. So I think if you have any more filmmaker stuff, we can talk about it now. But I wanted to talk about each of our leads and like how we felt they did with each character.
I have just a couple other things. Just the set design was something that was speaking to me a lot in this, and I feel like this is a blueprint that you see going forward for haunted house films. Like, you think of like Haunted Mansion
for sure. And I was wondering, like, did you see, was this filmed on like a real house? Because when they're on the exteriors, it looked really interesting. Like, it was like, is this a model or is this real? The way the sky was behind it almost looked unnatural. So I wasn't sure what was going on there.
So the externals were actually a location somewhere in England. The way that they achieved that weird look is they shot it on IR film or infrared film. And it's like, it makes it so that like certain things pop out and certain things are more dulled. So like, you're seeing how crisp and how interesting the house looks, and then the background looks a little like foggy and weird, like you're talking about. And that's like an iconic shot because of that. Yeah.
Interesting. And then they again, like we mentioned on the thing, they had some sort of really cool effect on the title card when it shows up, and it was all swirly, and then it coalesced into the haunting. And I'm like, they had to do that practically. I always have to think about that.
It's so cool. Like I wish that like in another life I would have just been like a title creator to just like, you know what I mean? Those are so cool that they do that practically.
Yeah.
So one thing we have to talk about is Shirley Jackson, because this came out like 4 years after the novel, which is wild to think about.
Wow, yeah, I didn't even think about that. Good point.
So director Robert Wise read a review of Shirley Jackson's novel, The Haunting of Hill House, in Time magazine and decided to get the rights to the novel. He later met the writer herself to talk about ideas for the film. He asked if she had thought of any other titles for the novel because the title would not work for the film. She told him that the only other title she had considered was simply The Haunting, so Wise decided to use that for the film.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it works okay. There is an interesting decision to make things more accessible, which I get. I noticed it also in the opening, right? Because the opening of the film, almost identical to the opening of the book, which is so iconic, but they omit the katydids and the, you know, it's like this kind of weird line from the book gets changed. And it's again, it's like, I think it's because some people just don't know what that is, and they're going to be like, what are you even talking about? And so they didn't want to start the movie off that way. But I don't know, I like that sort of discombobulation you have at the start of the book when you're like, what is it even talking about? I don't know, and you lose a little bit of that, so I kind of missed it.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about the VO here in a second, but I wanted to talk about Jackson's reaction to the film. After seeing it, she told a reporter it terrified her. She said, quote, "I couldn't believe that I had written this." Off record, She wasn't thrilled with some plot changes, but she loved the deadly edifice itself, represented in exterior shots by Eddington Hall, a Gothic mansion near Stratford-upon-Avon.
Yeah, okay, so that's the place in England you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There was some changes to the characters slightly, and the way they were portrayed. So it's interesting she picked up on that. And yeah, I mean, she wasn't happy with those plot changes. Maybe it's a good thing she didn't see Mike Flanagan's adaptation.
Yeah, right. He really ran with it and changed it a lot.
Because honestly, I felt like they were pretty minor as far as adaptations go.
Right.
You know, but it happens, right? You're trying to condense a novel into a 2-hour film.
I think as much as I like this, it's hard to capture what Shirley Jackson was achieving because it's something that I haven't read in a lot of stories also. It's very, like, the way that it's representing the terror is, like you said, like disorienting us with the medium in ways and like sort of confusing us and like that. I guess he tried to do that with as much as he could with his camera work and some of the sound design and stuff, but to me, like, it would have been really difficult to capture what Shirley Jackson was doing.
The interiority of the novel is something that fiction does really well. And we talked about how the prose itself is a window into Eleanor's mind as she's like losing it, essentially. And I think the decision to go with voiceover was made in an attempt to mimic that. And I think at times it works. Even if, especially early on, I was like, ooh, I don't know if I like this. But by the end, it kind of won me over because I saw that what they were able to do with the voiceover was to try and as best they could to mimic that. Yeah. So I think I understand why the decision was made.
Yeah, which is all you can really do, right? Is like trying to represent the words exactly and getting the internal thoughts. You have to do VO. And I think it's good for this. I think it worked for this adaptation. But sometimes VO, you know, it's just like you're just telling people stuff at some point. It could just be exposition, so it's difficult to walk that line.
Well, and like we just covered Dune, and one of the things that we praised about it was it didn't do VO. So like it can be done. You can have interiority, and you can do it with subtleties of performance. It's difficult to do with this story in particular, though. So I'm not comfortable enough to say you should never do VO in an adaptation, or you should always do VO in an adaptation. I think neither statement is true. It's going to depend heavily on the material and what you're trying to accomplish with it.
Definitely, yeah. So a couple other movies that he directed that I thought were notable. Andromeda Strain, which is something that we might cover at some point. It's the 1971 film.
This is the adaptation of Crichton's novel, right?
Right. And then also this is not an adaptation, but he actually directed Star Trek the movie, the first one.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
1979.
I think I've seen that one, yeah.
Yeah. Also The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951. Wow.
And now that one we might cover. That's an adaptation.
Exactly.
Okay, so we might return to this filmmaker on the main feed. That's cool.
We might, yeah. So it's really interesting to see that he he was a genre guy. Like he did horror, noir, western, war, science fiction, musical, drama. It's really awesome to see someone like that in the 60s and 70s. Also, he received the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award in 1998. So
nice. Yeah, well deserved, it seems like. Well, speaking of sort of legendary figures, I was looking through the performers in this, the actors, and a lot of them have had these storied careers. And I want to talk about all of our leads, but before we do, I want to mention a one-off. I saw this a flash of this person who looked really familiar. This woman at the beginning who falls down some stairs. I believe that is a Ava Gardner. I believe that's
Really?
Ava Gardner. When I see on the cast list, she's listed in the cast, but I'm not seeing a credit as to who she played. So I'm like, that must be her, and I think that's who it was in this face. Anyway, Ava Gardner is like a pretty famous figure in like classic Hollywood. So I just thought it was interesting that she had like a small role in this movie.
Cameo role, yeah.
Yeah, almost a cameo.
Was this? I wonder where this would fall within her career.
Yeah, it was in '60s, so I think it was actually, she was pretty well established at this point. So I think it was more of a cameo, like, holy crap, that's Ava Gardner, and then she dies.
That's cool. I'd be interested to see if they'd worked together before.
Yeah, I don't know. But let's talk about our leads, because I think all of them I have thoughts, right? Okay, so let's start with Dr. Markway, which was a change from Montague, I believe, in the book. I don't know why they changed that, but they did. And Richard Johnson is the actor who plays him, and definitely thought he did a good job. He was very old-timey in a way that reminds me of like a certain generation of men. And there's just this funny like cultural thing, I guess, that was going on where it was like okay to just grab women by the arms and like move them around and like treat them like they're children, and he does a little bit of that, which is very odd. And whenever he did it, it like made me physically like cringe. I'm like, oh, don't do that. But it was like fine, because that's like what you did back in the day. You just grabbed women by the arms and like told them go to the other room or whatever.
It's so interesting too, because it's like, of course there was like domestic violence was pretty prevalent in the home, but it's interesting too because a lot of films of the time had these like dramatic moments where it's like you got to grab somebody by the shoulders or grab their arms and yank them around and get dramatic and yell in their face. That's
the way that film is a reflection of culture, but also can reinforce things, right?
Right.
And you could tell that the screenwriters have encountered this in their lives, and they've internalized it in a way where they're like, this is okay in a situation where you need to like assert some sort of control. Someone's being a little bit hysterical, perhaps, to use a word that is obviously very gendered. And that was the way you dealt with it back in the day. Now, we don't see anyone like slap anybody here, but like in a lot of movies, you will see that, right? Like some man will just haul off and slap a woman to like get her under control. And that was considered okay.
And it was like a weird cliche thing that they would just do for whatever reason in dramatic like scenes. I don't know.
And like, I'm sure that it wasn't okay on some level. And it was that thing where they're like, but in this situation, it's okay. So I'm going to put it in the movie. And like, I don't know. It's a weird remnant of the time that I definitely picked up on. But yeah, I mean, he wears this like corduroy suit, head to toe corduroy, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
I have a corduroy jacket that I actually got recently that I really like. And just seeing the corduroy pants with the corduroy jacket, I'm like, that is such a look. I kind of wish I had been able to see it in color, because I'm like, what color is this suit? I don't know. I'm really curious. Probably brown, right? I don't know.
Brown, tan, dark, like somewhere in there.
That really puts if he's wearing a tan corduroy head to toe suit throughout this movie, that really puts a spin on that character that I wish I could have seen.
Yeah, right.
He was interesting, right? Like, he's very professional. First off, I like the supernatural investigation angle of the book. I love it so much, and it's cool that it's in this movie. It reminds me of one of my favorite YouTube channel. I don't know, it's not a channel really. It's a series on the BuzzFeed channel. It's BuzzFeed Supernatural, and it's this guy Shane and Ryan who go into different haunted areas, and one of them is like a super believer, Ryan, and the Shane is a complete skeptic. And I really liked that because later on when Grace, his wife, shows up, she is like a complete skeptic. And it reminded me of that a little bit. And like, obviously this is fictionalized, so it's going to go, everything's a little different, but I don't know. I think that stuff's really fascinating, and I'm a complete skeptic. I'm Shaniac, if you're aware of how they term things in that show. That's how I am too. So, but it's fun to see a character come in who is like super skeptical and is going to have to learn that this is real in this world.
Yeah. Well, it's fun to like think of it, like you said, as an investigation, even as a skeptic, because people are so, because people believe it. There's part of you that's like, I mean, yeah, I would go check it out and see what's happening in a sense and try to see if we can figure out a logical reason for this. Otherwise, and even if there's something unexplained, even if you're a skeptic, you're like, well, that's unexplainable. It wasn't a ghost, but it was something.
Well, and it engages with the viewer or reader's skepticism in a way that is natural within the story, right? Like, we're talking to a skeptic character, right, on screen, but really we're talking to the audience because many of you are skeptics. But in order to get you to be afraid, we need to like open up just a little bit of your skepticism so that you can allow yourself to be afraid of a haunted house. And I think it's brilliant, and that all goes to Shirley Jackson, who was clever enough to put that in her novel. So let's move on to Luke, because Luke in this movie is, I think, one of the bigger changes. He feels very different to me. Now, Luke was not completely likable in the book by any stretch. He was kind of a dick. But this version of Luke, I hated. He was so pompous, and like he was such a moment in time, like a I don't know, like a Frank Sinatra type, or like he wanted to be that. I don't know what you would call that, but like that wise guy, the way he cracks his jokes, and he's kind of misogynistic. He's making these offhanded comments.
He's always got a drink in his hand.
I mean, he's such a character from this time period, and I really dislike this guy. And I felt like Luke was a more nuanced character in the book, where like I disliked him in some scenes, liked him in others. He had more of a relationship with Eleanor, whereas it felt like they changed it a little bit and gave it more to the Doctor. Like the Doctor and Eleanor had more like a sort of romantic tension.
That was something weird that we should address too. Is like that, like it's like this. His wife is there, and they're still having these like dramatic, like holding moments, touching.
Oh
faces
he like
and
touches
stuff,
her face. Like clearly, he's got like some sort of attraction for her. And his wife's there. So like they introduced this element that I don't remember being present in the book. Now she definitely had Eleanor was kind of attracted to everybody, it felt like. I think that does include the Doctor, but I felt like it was more focused on Luke, who was, I think, more age appropriate to her. Now, we should also mention, and I want to save Eleanor for last, but just real quick. The actor, Julie Harris, I looked her up, and like she is older than the Doctor. She's older than Theo. The actress herself she was just born like earlier. So I felt like it was kind of weird the whole time because she was acting so childish in a way, and I couldn't figure out why it was striking me kind of wrong. And I think it's because like you can look at her and tell she's older than some of these people, and so it was weird to see her acting in such a sort of younger role. Like she was acting as if she was younger. Now maybe back in the day this wasn't as apparent, but now that we have like HD, you can really tell. But maybe that's why they felt like they could do this sort of Dr. Eleanor romance tension, because they were around the same age. Whereas I think in the book it was a bigger gap, and it would be even creepier and weird.
It didn't make any sense to me. I didn't want it to happen, and I was bummed when it was happening. Like, just like because they're the leads of the story, they have to have some sort of tension. I'm just like, oh, bummer. Like, it's what a waste of time. Like, we could have explored something else in the story, but it's of the time, I think. But let's talk about Theodora and the relationship with Eleanor specifically.
Claire Bloom, that was a name when I looked at it that was familiar. Her face seemed familiar. She was one of my favorite. Actually, she was my favorite performance in the movie. I loved her as Theo, and one of the things I loved about it is I thought she really captured the really strange kind of mysterious behavior of Theo in the book, where you can't figure out like, does she like Eleanor? Is she attracted to Eleanor? Is she being mean and bullying to Eleanor? Is she doing all of these things? Like, is she being affected by the house or not? It's like, it's really difficult to tell.
Keeping the audience guessing, for sure.
And she does that. Like, every time she was on screen, like, I didn't know what kind of Theo we were going to get in this scene. Like, is she going to be really friendly and helpful, or is she going to be mean and bullying? what's going to happen with Theo in this? And I thought there was a real sexual tension between the two of them that I think at the time was probably pretty taboo to put in a movie. Now, they didn't lean into it heavily, but I felt like it was implied enough that like she would look at her in ways, and she mentioned her partner, and I don't know, there were moments where they would linger. Like, there was a moment when they linger on the statue, and I think it's like two women holding each other, and they had talked about how, oh, you're this woman. And it seemed to imply that maybe there could be something there. And we know that that's a thing in the book we read about.
Right. It's definitely there. And I actually read something that like these actors were excited to tackle like a complex character that had, especially this time period, people were not as accepting of those sorts of relationships. And like, I guess there was like some memos that came down, and they were like, they can play these characters, but they're not allowed to touch or something like that. And then they were like, fuck that, because they ended up touching a bunch of
they absolutely do.
Times.
She Theo falls, or Eleanor like falls asleep on her at one point and stuff. And they keep talking about sisters. And I love every time she said like, oh, you'd be like sisters. She says it in a way that's almost like disgusted, almost something like that's what I have to say, but I wish it wasn't that way. I don't know. Again, this version of Theo is interesting in the same way that she was in the book. And I was really surprised, pleasantly, honestly, that they were able to capture that so well in this movie.
Yeah.
And I didn't even realize that I like wanted that so badly in an adaptation, but she really nailed it.
Yeah. Oh, I have something I wanted to mention about Luke, and then I think we should talk about Eleanor. With Luke, Russ Tamblyn, who plays him, actually was in Flanagan's adaptation as Eleanor's like therapist.
Oh, is that the guy who is Montague? Because that's who's her therapist in the adaptation. That's so
I think
funny.
so. Yeah.
That's a cool little nod that I totally miss. Because I hadn't seen this, so that's great. And I think there were a few, like in retrospect, references to this movie. Yes. Some of the way that those statues looked honestly felt like a reference to this movie.
Definitely.
Some of the look of the house.
Yeah, the scene with the door is so clearly like the same thing.
The way that Eleanor dances, honestly, was I think a reference to how it looks in this. I mean, she does it in the book, but like the way it looked in the nightgown and everything, I think was reminiscent of this. Interesting. Are you ready to talk about Eleanor?
Let's do it. Yeah, I have some background.
So Eleanor, again, I felt like she was a little older than I always imagined Eleanor to be, and that kind of changes the role for me a little bit. She also had that very stagey performance, which at times I thought worked well, and at other times was almost a detriment for me, in my taste.
Yeah, no, I agree. Honestly, there was a little bit of that with almost all the characters in this, but with this character specifically, there was like this heightened, state of like panic at times, and like, trying to get into that. I think the actor like brought maybe a little more than was necessary, just like being over the top in ways.
Yeah, I mean, because when you're on stage, you kind of over emote, right? Because the audience who is not in your face, they're viewing from a distance, needs to experience usually what you're doing. And so you over emote. And I felt like she was over emoting some emotions that should be subtler.
Right. I actually read that Julie Harris felt so everyone had a great time on this film besides Julie Harris. And apparently Julie Harris felt like a sense of isolation. Some of the other actors were talking about like if it was like self-inflicted, like to kind of get into the role. But she felt like isolated and felt like everybody else was sort of like against her in ways. But everyone else, the director, everyone has said the director is like a gentleman, really nice. Everything went perfectly, would look out for the actors. But something about what was going on, I guess, and it reminds me of other movies like The Shining, where we hear about Kubrick like torturing his actors. That was quite different when
the actor was antagonizing.
But that it's not a director antagonizing as much as it's like there's this experience that an actor's having on set, and I do think some of that comes through in the hysteria scenes. But at the same time, like I don't know that. I feel like it might be one of those stories that gets like told and then told again. And it's a game of telephone, and it becomes like kind of blown out of proportion and becomes legend for the movie. Because from what I understand, like. It felt isolated and felt like different than everybody else.
It kind of too perfectly lines up with Eleanor in the book. where like I could see it, like, right, like you read, like she probably read the book, she's inhabiting this role and trying to get in this mind space, and Eleanor is isolated from everyone else, and she begins to bond with the house as opposed to the people, and that's like a lot of the problem, right, is that she becomes loyal to the house instead of to the group. And it's funny that she would say that she was feeling that way, and it's almost like, is she playing that up a little bit for the mystique of the film?
Right.
I don't know.
And I think that might be part of it. But I will say, like, if you're the lead in a film, a lot of times you have scenes by yourself, whereas everybody else is always in a scene with somebody else in this film for the most part.
And she did have a lot of scenes like that where she's like off on her own, she's having voiceover, and she's doing that thing where she's like, I'm thinking a thought and I'm nodding along to it, and then I have in my thought I'm like, oh, but what about this? And then I'm gonna like make my face kind of look confused, and like that was the kind of stuff where at times the VO felt too much. Like I prefer a VO that is almost disconnected from the performance on the face, because it gets a little weird to me when those two things line up.
Yeah, I agree.
And okay, but I mean, so overall though, I thought she was good, and I thought the VO work early, again, was rubbing me the wrong way. She's on the drive and she's having these thoughts, and they're showing her reactions as she's looking at the stone lions, which I was actually quite delighted made it into the movie, that detail. And I was like, I don't know about this VO. But as the movie progressed, it set up the fact that we're going to continue to have her VO where she starts thinking through why she is now feeling more at home. She's feeling accepted. She's feeling sort of bonded to the house in a way that is essential to this story working. And it won me over. And again, like her performance, even at times it was a bit much. There were also moments where she's sort of losing herself to the house where I thought it was nailing it. And I thought it was actually quite good. So yeah, I really overall enjoyed her performance, even if I had some quibbles. And it was a bit odd to see her. She's like, I think she's like 6 years older than Theo. And I thought it was odd to see Theo interacting with her in a way where it seemed like she's the much older, wiser woman. And that's the implication I always got from the character in the book. And yet, obviously she's 6 years older than her, so it just looked a little odd.
It's funny, I didn't really pick up on the age as much as I picked up on like the characters that they were portraying. Like I can see what you're saying now that I know their ages, but I just assumed that, like you said, her character is a little more like innocent and like younger feeling, and so.
Do you remember in the book, like, because to me, like it was that was present for Eleanor, but I don't remember thinking Eleanor is just so naive in the book.
I feel like she was a little bit, but
she was definitely a little bit, but it seemed almost like, again, like they played that up even more and made her even more naive and like not worldly. I don't know. Like Eleanor in the book was more clever, I think, than this version. Whereas this version truly felt like I'm gonna get swept up in the house. I'm gonna lose all sense of self. And there was more of a self-awareness in the Eleanor in the book that I remember, at least. I agree, and because of that, I think I liked Eleanor more in the book and sort of empathized with her more than this version of Eleanor. Whereas this version of Eleanor felt like she got herself into trouble. And when she died at the end, I think the attitude of the film mimics how I was feeling about it, because the characters, I was kind of shocked with how little they react to her dying.
Seriously.
Like, the doctor feels her pulse and he's like, well, she's dead. And then they stand up and they're like, now let's talk about what happened here. She did this to herself. Hill House is a dark place. I think it should be burned. And I'm like, there's a dead person. Like, she just fucking died and you're standing by her corpse right now.
I thought Theo specifically was going to have more of a reaction to it.
Yeah. Instead, and part of that is maybe some direction, some stuff like that, but and maybe something of the time. I don't know if maybe like they hadn't. I don't know if like there's just different attitudes towards death, but ultimately, I think it also represented a little bit of the difference in the character, because I think you are supposed to feel a little bit like she did this to herself, whereas I felt nothing but sadness for for Eleanor at the end of the book. And so that's a slight change too. But again, I mean, I liked it, and it was cool seeing even down to that crash, it happening. I mean, I think the only major scene that I missed, and I understand why they didn't do it because it would be very difficult with the technology at the time, was that walk in the garden where the world goes wild, right? Like everything shifts and becomes dark, and there's figures, and there's like something chasing them, and all of that. I love so much in the book, and I think that whole sequence gets omitted. And it's also the paranoia where she starts to think that Luke and Theo are laughing at her and like maybe having some sort of relationship form, and it's unclear whether or not she's jealous of Luke or if she's jealous of Theo. You know what I mean? Because you don't know where her attraction lies. And like that kind of stuff is a bit lost here because we don't get that scene. And maybe that's what Shirley Jackson was reacting to, was the sort of omission of that, which does change the character a little bit. I was amazed in the book how much tension could be in a scene where you're just hearing pounding outside of the room and you're huddled together, like wondering what's happening.
Right.
And I'll be damned if they didn't achieve that in this movie. Like there's a couple different scenes where there are people huddled in a room while there's noises outside of the room and there's like something rattling the handle. And each time I felt like they did a great job of achieving that tension and making it really amp up.
And I think by picking up like that pounding that you're talking about, like I'm glad you mentioned it on the episode because that was one of the major keys to the tension in a lot of the scenes for me. I was like, damn, this is like frightening, you know. It sounds like a drum. It's like a drum far away or something like that, but it works.
It clearly
because
wasn't
like
somebody like banging on a wall in the house itself in a way that you could go like, oh, that's somebody banging on a wall in the hallway or banging over here, which is kind of what I was imagining in the book. But instead, this was like a disconnected, like a drum or a pounding that
it could have. It sounded like it could have been a giant creature's footsteps or something crazy. Like you don't know what it is. Like.
Yeah, I mean, and that paranoia of Theo, because I think in the book, Theo gets convinced that it is Eleanor doing this at one point, and we lose some of that. So some of that stuff is lost.
There's a little bit of that in the film, like with the chalk on the wall. I think Theo does kind of lean towards Eleanor maybe having written that up there, and Eleanor's like, no, it wasn't me.
Yeah. One line I gotta point out, and this is only going to appeal to people who have a very similar taste in music to me and have heard similar songs. But there is a song called Supercharger Heaven by White Zombie, which begins with the quote, "I know the supernatural isn't something that's supposed to happen, but it does happen." And I had never knew where that line was from, and then I saw this movie, and it comes out of the doctor's mouth, and I paused it, and I was like, "Why is this line standing out to me?" And I had to like go through my memory and realize it was from a song, and I've heard it 100 times, or more in this song. So anyway, if you happen to know the song, you'll know what I'm talking about, and that's from this movie, which is
awesome.
Cool.
I love when that kind of stuff happens too. It's so fun. We just had that with Dune too.
Right? Yeah. Any other little details you want to get in here before we finish this thing up?
Not really. I'm just like, I was pleasantly surprised. A lot of this was straight from the book, and I think to see that sort of adaptation, especially at this time, was very cool. And like I said, the experimental things they were doing for this film, it was a fairly large budget film for the time, and to see them play with the the framing, the lens choice, they had like anamorphic lenses that were creating like a bending effect in some.
So I wanted to ask you a kind of a filmmaking question about that, because there was a couple of scenes where Eleanor would walk towards the camera, and the either other actors or just the background would go dark as she was approaching the camera, and it would isolate her and separate her from what else was going on. And I couldn't tell if they were physically like dimming the lights behind her on the set, or if it was a effect of maybe like the light was bright as she approached the camera, and because it focused on a brightness, it makes the background seem dimmer. Do you have a guess as to what was going on there?
I mean, so you're exposing film at this time period, so it's a little different. It's still the same in like the idea. What I think it was, because I know what you're talking about. I do think there was like some dimming that went on in the room as she left, but more than anything, I think that light source was mostly in front of them. So when she's close to the other characters, everyone's well lit. She starts walking, and the light source is moving with the camera. And then that way, like, it's like, there were probably other lights in the scene, like I said, and they were dimmed as they were walking away as well. But like that specific light source that's on her as she's walking into the hallway, and then the scene behind is no longer lit. I think that's probably how they got most of that.
Yeah, and another thing I was thinking of was like how there were some shots here that I wasn't used to getting in a film from this era, and I was thinking about how size of camera, right, is something that has evolved so much over time. And there was a shot where she's running down the hallway, and we're like really low in a room, and we see her from underneath as she's entering the doors. And I was just thinking about how that stuff was hard to do back in the day because the cameras were so big. Right. So it was cool that they were able to achieve that.
So we have to talk about this too. The spiral staircase is like a direct reference that Flanagan did to this film, like no question.
It looked it looked almost the same.
Exact same thing. But the spiral staircase, the camera like ascending the staircase like very quickly. They did that by creating a makeshift dolly track, and the camera was attached to the rail, and then like slowly it was allowed to slide down, and then they just reversed it to show it at high speed going up. So basically like it just like the camera grinded down the spiraling staircase.
And they reversed it? That's so cool.
Yeah.
So the only other couple of notes I wanted to mention here, I think I noticed there was a scene where they even had Eleanor with her thumb in her mouth. And I even saw some spit come out of it when she took her thumb out, which again, I don't know if you would notice that in like standard definition back in the day, but I was like, okay, so I felt like they were really leaning into that childlike effect. And then, which is cool. I think it further backs up my perception of what they were doing with the character. And then the only other thing I want to talk about is the wife, which I don't think we really mentioned, Grace. She comes and she stays there, and then she disappears. And she's sort of lost in the house, and then she like at one point her face comes into this like window while they're up there on the staircase, in a shocking moment, and she looks wild, right? Like she looks like I couldn't tell. I was like, is that supposed to be a ghost? And then I was like, wait, no, I think that's the wife. And when she kind of appears out of the darkness, definitely startling. And then again, right when she's about to crash into the tree, there's just this woman running through the woods.
Yeah,
and I was like, what the fuck? Like very surprising. And then she shows up and like talks through what's been going on, and clearly sort of just lost it from the house. And, the skeptic character has completely lost it. So I don't know. I feel like that's a slight change on the character in the book, who did some similar things, but definitely a little bit of a change. I don't know. What did you think of that difference?
I thought it was very interesting. The trapdoor moment where she like pops out, she's like covered in, apparently she gets lost, right? Like the house like is calling to her, and then she goes and gets lost, and eventually like opens the trapdoor right in time to scare them on top of the staircase. And then Eleanor faints because of that. And like this idea, I think it added to the tension. I think that's what they did with this character. They decided to make a choice to say, all right, let's throw her in this place, boom, jump scare. Let's throw her in the like running through the woods, boom, jump scare. And honestly, and then they were able to explain it in a way that was satisfying enough. I think it worked. I kind of liked it.
I think it worked too. I thought it was pretty cool. And overall, this movie works, and I can see why it's well regarded. I enjoyed it. I'm glad I've seen it now. It's one of those movies apparently that you need to see before you die, and I agree. It was good. It was fun, and it's a cool look at film history in a way that a lot of times we cover here. And I'm learning something about myself, I think, in these bonus episodes we do. I much prefer to watch a well-regarded older film that maybe has like started to fade from public consciousness than like a new film that's just bad. And that's why people don't talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a certain fun in that sometimes too. And you can dig into why it's so bad and stuff. But like, I don't know. I really liked watching this, and I'm realizing that I enjoyed these kind of throwback episodes.
I'm glad, dude. We're gonna get you to watch all kinds of old films and old foreign films. I love that, because that's something that I preach a lot too, and it's tough to get people to actually engage with this sort of material. Because people of different generations and stuff, like it's tough.
In a lot of ways, has stuff in there that I was not expecting for a movie from this era. Very fun. So I do recommend it. And until next time,
keep adapting.